The strains of a waltz drifted through the open terrace doors as Eleanor Ashworth pressed herself against the cool stone balustrade, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with dancing. The deep green velvet of her gown, carefully re-trimmed with cream lace to hide 3 years of wear, felt heavy against her skin as she tried to disappear into the shadows cast by the blooming wisteria overhead. She had heard him clearly, Lord Marcus Greville, his voice carrying over the champagne-bright laughter of Lady Montague's ballroom, boasting to his companions about how he would have her within the month, how her father's debts left her no choice, how even a ruined baronet's daughter should be grateful for his protection. The words had struck her like physical blows, each one a reminder of how far her family had fallen, how desperately trapped she was, and she had fled before anyone could see the shame burning in her cheeks. The cool April air kissed her heated face as she gripped the stone railing, her grandmother's ring on her right hand catching the moonlight, the only piece of jewelry she had left after everything else had been sold to pay creditors. 26 years old, she thought bitterly, invisible to society except as an object of pity, or worse, prey for men like Greville, who saw her father's £8,000 debt as an opportunity. In 3 weeks, her sister Sophia would make her debut. Sweet, innocent Sophia, who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings, who had no idea that their father had already gambled away her dowry along with everything else. Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill, when a low voice from the shadows made her spin around. "The ballroom becomes rather suffocating after a while, does it not?" The man stepped forward into a patch of moonlight, and Eleanor's breath caught for an entirely different reason as she took in the tall figure in evening black, the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, silver in the moon's glow, the way he held himself with military precision despite the social setting. She did not recognize him in the darkness, this stranger who had apparently sought the same refuge she had, and perhaps it was that anonymity, that blessed relief from the weight of names and titles and reputation, that loosened her tongue. "Suffocating is rather apt," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "though I suspect we flee different sorts of suffocation, sir. You from too much attention, perhaps, and I from the wrong kind entirely." The stranger tilted his head, and she caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed to see too much, even in the dim light. "The wrong kind?" he prompted, his voice carrying an unexpected note of genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. Eleanor turned back to face the garden, unable to stop the bitter laugh that escaped her lips. "The kind that comes from being hunted, sir, though I suppose that is too dramatic a word for what amounts to a simple transaction where everyone knows the terms except the merchandise herself has not quite accepted her fate." Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The stranger stepped closer, and Eleanor realized with a start that her hands were trembling where they gripped the balustrade, the cold seeping through her thin evening gloves as the moon climbed higher in the darkening sky. "Hunted," he repeated, his voice carrying an edge she couldn't quite identify, something between curiosity and a darker emotion that made her pulse quicken. "By whom, may I ask?" She should have deflected, should have remembered her place, her precarious position in society. But something about the anonymity of the darkness, the way he stood apart from the glittering crowd inside, loosened the careful guard she always maintained. "Lord Marcus Greville," she said, the name bitter on her tongue, "though I suppose it hardly matters since you wouldn't know. He holds my father's debts, you see, £8,000 due in 4 weeks, and he has made it abundantly clear that he will accept payment in a currency other than gold." The stranger went very still, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something dangerous. "Greville," he said, and the way he pronounced the name made Eleanor look at him more closely, catching the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his gloved hands had clenched at his sides. "I know him well enough. A coward who let better men die in Spain while he hid behind his connections. And now he preys on young women in London ballrooms." Eleanor's breath caught at the vehemence in his tone, at the sudden fierce protectiveness from this stranger who didn't even know her name. "You speak as though you were there," she said softly, and he turned to face her fully, the moonlight illuminating the terrible scar that marked him as surely as any medal of valor. "I was," he said simply, and then, as though remembering himself, "Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornfield, at your service, Miss—" The blood drained from Eleanor's face as she realized whom she had been speaking to with such shocking frankness, the infamous War Duke himself, the man society whispered about behind fans and calling cards, who was said to be as cold as winter and twice as unforgiving. She dropped into a hasty curtsy, mortification burning through her as she tried to step backward, to flee, but his hand shot out, catching her elbow gently but firmly. "Please," he said, and there was something almost urgent in his voice. "Don't run. Not when you're the first person in months to speak to me as though I were merely a man and not a title or a curiosity." Eleanor looked up at him, seeing past the scar to the weariness in his eyes, the isolation that matched her own, and found herself staying even as every proper instinct screamed at her to leave. "Your Grace," she began, but he cut her off with a gesture. "Frederick," he said, "at least here in the darkness where titles seem rather meaningless. And you are?" "Eleanor Ashworth," she whispered, waiting for the recognition, the dismissal, but he merely nodded, as though her father's disgrace meant nothing, his attention fixed on her face with an intensity that made her shiver, though the night was not truly cold. The imposing facade of the Thornfield townhouse loomed before Eleanor as she stood on the pavement at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, her best day dress doing little to bolster her courage despite the careful mending she had done to hide its worn edges. And she nearly turned away twice before forcing herself up the steps where a stern-faced butler opened the door before she could knock, his expression revealing nothing as he led her through halls lined with dark wood and military paintings to a study that seemed to embody everything she had learned about Frederick Ravenscroft in their brief moonlit encounter. All masculine severity and controlled power, with maps of Spanish campaigns covering one wall and not a single flower or soft touch to relieve the darkness. And there he stood behind a massive desk, looking every inch the War Duke in morning light that revealed his scar more starkly than moonlight had, his black-gloved hands resting on papers as he watched her enter with an expression so carefully businesslike that she felt both relieved and oddly disappointed, as though some part of her had hoped for warmth after their strange intimacy on the terrace. But perhaps this was better, she thought. Easier to remember, this was merely a transaction. When he looked at her as though she were a military problem to be solved, rather than a woman who had spoken to him of being hunted, and when he gestured for her to sit, she noticed how his eyes lingered on her right hand, on the simple gold band set with a small sapphire that adorned her finger, and his first words surprised her with their unexpected personal nature. "Your ring, Miss Ashworth. It seems an unusual choice for a young lady." And she found herself touching it unconsciously, as she replied with deliberate brevity, "It was my grandmother's, Your Grace, one of the few things that could not be sold." And he nodded, not pushing for more, though she sensed his curiosity, before sliding a document across the desk toward her, his voice returning to that careful neutral tone as he outlined the terms of their arrangement. 1 week as his fiancée at his mother's house party at Thornfield Manor, public displays of affection only when strictly necessary for the charade, separate bedrooms, of course, and at the end she would be free to break the engagement publicly, claiming whatever reason would best serve her reputation, and in exchange he would settle her father's debts immediately. The £8,000 that would free her from Greville's threats, and she tried to refuse when he mentioned a dress allowance, her pride flaring at the thought of taking more than absolutely necessary. But his voice turned sharp as he reminded her that the Duke of Thornfield's fiancée could not appear in mended gowns without raising the very questions they sought to avoid. And she subsided, knowing he was right even as it stung, and they were just finalizing the details of their departure in 3 days when he said almost casually, "The debts are already paid, by the way. I visited Lord Greville at dawn." And Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she realized she was already bound to him, her only bargaining chip spent before she had even agreed to his terms. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to their rented rooms in Belgravia's shabby-genteel quarter that late April afternoon, her mind churning over the morning's meeting with Frederick Ravenscroft and the impossible bargain she had struck, knowing she must now face her family with a lie that would taste bitter on her tongue even as it saved them all from ruin. And when she pushed open the door at precisely 4 o'clock, she found Sophia bent over her embroidery by the window where the light was best, her golden hair catching the afternoon sun in a way that reminded Eleanor painfully of their mother, while their father sat hunched over his accounts at the scarred writing desk, his trembling hands betraying the illness that gripped him whenever he was too long from the gaming tables. And Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering her courage before speaking the words that would change everything. "I have news," she said, her voice steadier than her heart. "I am engaged to be married to the Duke of Thornfield." And the silence that followed seemed to stretch forever before Sophia's embroidery hoop clattered to the floor and she flew across the room to embrace her sister, tears of joy streaming down her face as she exclaimed, "Oh, Eleanor, how wonderful! When did this happen? Why didn't you tell me you had met someone?" While Sir Thomas rose slowly from his chair, his face a mixture of disbelief and pathetic gratitude, as he whispered, "The Duke of Thornfield. But how? When?" And Eleanor felt the weight of deception settling on her shoulders as she crafted her tale, speaking of meeting Frederick at Lady Montague's ball, of his unexpected proposal, carefully omitting that it was a business arrangement born of mutual desperation rather than love. And Sophia's innocent delight made each word feel like a betrayal, especially when she clasped Eleanor's hands and said, "You must be so happy to think that someone saw past all the gossip and recognized your true worth." And Eleanor forced a smile, remembering Frederick's businesslike demeanor that morning, the way he had made it clear this was merely a transaction, nothing more. But before she could sink too deeply into guilt, a knock came at the door and their landlady announced a delivery, and Eleanor watched in growing amazement as footmen carried in a large box bearing the name of London's finest modiste. And when Sophia lifted the lid with reverent hands, they all gasped at the gown within. Deep blue silk that shimmered with silver embroidery, finer than anything Eleanor had owned even in their prosperous days. And as she touched the fabric with wondering fingers, Sophia noticed her grandmother's ring and said softly, "You never take it off, do you? And now you'll have so many beautiful jewels to wear alongside it." But Eleanor barely heard her, lost in the unexpected thoughtfulness of Frederick choosing this particular shade of blue, somehow knowing without being told that it would suit her perfectly. And she felt the first dangerous crack in the armor she had built around her heart, realizing that someone, even in a business arrangement, had thought specifically of what might please her, what might make her feel beautiful. And Sir Thomas was weeping openly now, saying over and over, "My dear girl, you have saved us all," never questioning the miracle of a duke choosing his disgraced daughter. Already she could see the fevered light returning to his eyes as he calculated how soon he might return to his beloved card tables, now that the spectre of debt no longer haunted him. And Eleanor knew with sinking certainty that this reprieve was only temporary, that her father's weakness would surface again. But for now she pushed that fear aside and let Sophia's joy wash over her, even as the beautiful gown seemed to mock her with its promise of a fairy tale that was nothing more than an elaborate deception. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her bedchamber at precisely 2:30 that April afternoon, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the blue silk gown that transformed her from the desperate woman who had fled to a moonlit terrace into someone who might credibly pass as the Duke of Thornfield's chosen bride, though the whisper of impostor repeated in her mind with each adjustment to the silver embroidery that caught the light streaming through her window. And when the carriage arrived at 3 o'clock sharp, she descended the stairs with careful dignity, ignoring the landlady's wide-eyed stare and Sophia's excited flutter of encouragement from the doorway, finding Frederick already waiting inside the elegant vehicle, his black-gloved hands resting on his walking stick, as he watched her approach with an expression she could not read, and when he stepped out to offer his arm for her entry into the carriage, she felt the solid strength beneath the superfine wool of his coat, and wondered if he could feel her nervousness through the thin kid of her gloves. But his face remained that careful mask of neutrality as they settled into their seats and the driver urged the matched greys toward Hyde Park, where all of fashionable London would gather to see and be seen during the sacred hour of the afternoon promenade, and the silence between them grew heavy until Frederick said quietly, "You need not look as though you're being led to the scaffold, Miss Ashworth," which startled a small sound from her that was not quite a laugh as she replied, "Forgive me, Your Grace, I had not realized that facing the combined judgment of London society should fill me with joy." And something shifted in his expression, perhaps approval for her directness. Before he offered his arm as the carriage slowed near the park entrance, and Eleanor took it, this first deliberate public touch that declared to all the world that the ruined Ashworth girl had somehow captured the attention of the notorious War Duke. And as they entered the park, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations stopping mid-sentence, fans fluttering faster as ladies leaned together to whisper, gentlemen raising quizzing glasses with expressions of disbelief, and Eleanor felt each stare like a physical weight, even as she kept her chin high and her steps measured beside Frederick's steady pace. And then Lady Harriet Chamberlain's voice carried on the afternoon breeze, pitched just loud enough to be overheard as she always intended. "The War Duke and the debtor's daughter, what a matched pair of damaged goods. Though I suppose desperation makes strange bedfellows." And Eleanor felt Frederick's arm tense beneath her hand. But before either could react, a familiar figure approached them with barely concealed fury. Lord Greville's handsome features twisted with rage as he blocked their path, his voice dripping false courtesy as he said, "Miss Ashworth, what an unexpected pleasure. I trust you are enjoying your current circumstances." With emphasis that made his meaning crystal clear, "Do enjoy it while it lasts." And Eleanor felt Frederick shift, stepping slightly forward to position himself between her and Greville with the same tactical precision he must have used on countless battlefields, his voice dropping to Arctic temperatures as he said, "You will address my fiancée with proper respect, Greville, or you will address my seconds. The choice is yours." Eleanor arrived at the imposing townhouse on Grosvenor Square at precisely 2 o'clock that April afternoon, her heart hammering against her ribs as she climbed the marble steps to meet Lady Beatrice Ravenscroft for the first time, knowing that this inspection would determine whether she could successfully play the role of Frederick's fiancée for the crucial week ahead. And when the butler showed her into the formal drawing-room, she was struck immediately by the warmth that pervaded this space, compared to the austere study where she had signed away her freedom just 2 days prior, with vases of fresh roses adorning every surface and watercolors of pastoral scenes softening the elegant walls. Clearly the domain of a woman who had managed to bring light into what Eleanor had assumed would be an entirely cold household, and there in the center of it all stood Lady Beatrice herself, a handsome woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate style and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, wearing deep purple silk that proclaimed her continued mourning for a husband 10 years gone, the jet ring on her finger catching the afternoon light as she gestured for Eleanor to approach, and Eleanor executed her most perfect curtsy, the one her governess had drilled into her years ago, when such graces still mattered, holding it precisely the right length of time before rising to meet those penetrating eyes that seemed to see through every pretense, and Lady Beatrice circled her slowly, like a hawk evaluating prey, asking in a deceptively pleasant voice about her family, her education, her accomplishments, and Eleanor found herself answering with unexpected honesty about their reduced circumstances, about teaching herself Italian when they could no longer afford masters, about making over old gowns when new ones became impossible, refusing to dissemble or pretend to be anything other than what she was, a gentleman's daughter brought low by circumstances beyond her control. And something flickered in Lady Beatrice's expression at this forthrightness. "You don't dissemble," she observed with something that might have been approval. "How refreshing! How dangerous!" And before Eleanor could puzzle out this cryptic statement, the door opened and Frederick entered, his presence immediately filling the room with that peculiar tension he carried like armor. And without seeming to think about it, he positioned himself near Eleanor's chair, not touching but close enough that she could sense the protective wall of his presence, and his mother's sharp eyes tracked this movement with sudden interest, the way her son stood guard over this young woman he claimed to have chosen, and when tea was served, Eleanor's hands remained perfectly steady as she poured, a skill retained from better days that Frederick noticed with what might have been appreciation, while the conversation continued its delicate dance of questions and carefully calibrated responses, Lady Beatrice mentioning her late husband and how the Ravenscroft men had always been known for their cold hearts until the right woman melted them, speaking of how Frederick had nearly died in Spain, how the surgeons had given him up for lost, how she had sat by his bedside for weeks praying for a miracle, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten at the image of this formidable woman reduced to helpless vigil over her broken son, understanding suddenly the fierce protectiveness that drove her matchmaking efforts, and when Lady Beatrice finally dismissed Frederick on some errand, she fixed Eleanor with those penetrating eyes and said quietly, "He has not stood that close to anyone in 3 years, Miss Ashworth, not since he came home more dead than alive. So I will say this only once," her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Do not hurt him. Whatever game you two are playing, do not hurt my son." And Eleanor felt the words like a physical blow, realizing that perhaps their deception was not as complete as they had believed. But more than that, understanding for the first time that there might be depths to Frederick Ravenscroft that went beyond the cold, scarred duke who had bargained for a convenient bride, and she found herself whispering back with complete sincerity, "I would never intentionally cause him pain, my lady," which seemed to satisfy something in the older woman, who nodded once and rang for fresh tea, the rest of the visit passing in discussion of the house party preparations and the guest list that would, Eleanor learned with a sinking heart, include Lord Greville among the 15 expected visitors. The carriage arrived at the Ashworth lodgings at precisely 8 o'clock on that clear April morning, and Eleanor descended the narrow stairs with her small valise, trying to quiet the flutter of nerves that had kept her awake most of the night. Finding Frederick already waiting inside the elegant vehicle, estate papers spread across his lap in what she suspected was his own form of armor against the awkwardness of their first extended time alone together, and as she settled into the plush velvet seat across from him, she noticed how the morning light streaming through the window caught the silver threads in his dark hair and threw his scar into sharp relief, making him appear both younger and more battle-worn than his 32 years, and for several miles they travelled in silence, broken only by the rhythmic clip of hooves and the occasional rustle of his papers, until Eleanor withdrew her book from her reticule, a Gothic novel that promised dark secrets and mysterious heroes, which drew Frederick's attention immediately as he glanced up from his documents with something like surprise. "A novel, Miss Ashworth? I would have expected poetry from a young lady preparing for a house party." And she found herself responding with more honesty than wisdom. "Poetry is for people with time to feel, Your Grace. Novels are for those who need to escape." And something shifted in his expression before he laughed, a genuine sound of surprised delight that transformed his harsh features so completely that Eleanor found herself staring, watching how the stern lines around his mouth softened and his grey eyes warmed to the colour of summer rain. And then his laughter died as quickly as it had come, his hand moving unconsciously to his scarred cheek, as though her stare had reminded him of his disfigurement. And Eleanor heard herself saying softly, "You should do that more often. Laugh. It suits you," which seemed to leave him completely without words as he turned his attention back to his papers, though she noticed he wasn't actually reading them, and the silence that fell between them now felt different, charged with possibility rather than awkwardness. And when they stopped at a coaching inn for luncheon, he helped her from the carriage with a careful touch that lingered perhaps a moment longer than propriety demanded, his gloved fingers warm against her own as they entered the inn where the proprietor clearly knew him well, addressing him with genuine respect rather than mere deference to rank. And over their simple meal of cold meats and fresh bread, Eleanor found herself telling him about her childhood at Ashworth Hall before the debts and disgrace, how she used to ride every morning through the meadows, how she missed the library with its smell of leather and old paper. And he reciprocated with his own memories of Thornfield, admitting with reluctant honesty that he despised the house party tradition, but maintained it for his mother, who had been lonely since his father's death. And when Eleanor carefully ventured that his mother seemed formidable, but kind, he smiled slightly and said, "She would be pleased to hear that. She was quite taken with your refusal to dissemble yesterday." And Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she confessed, "I was once engaged to a gentleman named Philip Langdon, who terminated our understanding the moment my father's debts became public knowledge. After that betrayal, I found I had lost both the ability and the inclination to pretend to be anything other than what I am." And Frederick's expression darkened with something that might have been anger on her behalf as they returned to the carriage for the final portion of their journey, passing through a small village where tenants and shopkeepers emerged to wave at their duke with genuine affection, children running alongside the carriage calling greetings that Frederick acknowledged with a raised hand and slight smile, and Eleanor realized with surprise that the cold, scarred Duke of London gossip bore little resemblance to this man who clearly cared for his people and was loved in return. And as they rounded the final bend in the long drive, Thornfield Manor rose before them in all its grey stone magnificence, ivy climbing the walls and ancient oaks standing sentinel, and Eleanor's breath caught at the sheer imposing beauty of the place that would be her stage for the next 5 days, feeling Frederick's eyes on her as she absorbed the sight of what might have been her home in truth if their arrangement were real, and she wondered if he could sense the bittersweet longing that twisted in her chest at the thought. Eleanor stood in the centre of the elegant bedroom that would be hers for the next 5 days, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the gold leaf pattern on the green silk wallpaper, still unable to quite believe she was truly here at Thornfield Manor as Frederick's supposed fiancée. And when Mrs. Fleming had shown her to this chamber with its massive 4-poster bed draped in matching green damask and its tall windows overlooking the rose garden below, the housekeeper's manner had been noticeably warmer than the cold reception she had received from the London servants, as though word had already spread through the household that their master had chosen this particular young woman above all others. And Eleanor had thanked her with genuine gratitude before the older woman departed with a knowing smile. leaving her alone to absorb the overwhelming luxury of her temporary quarters. But it was the mahogany door in the far wall that drew her attention like a lodestone, its polished surface gleaming in the afternoon light, and she approached it slowly, her heart beginning to race as she realized what it must be, a connecting door to the Duke's own chambers, and though she knew it would be locked, could even see the brass key glinting on what must be Frederick's side through the narrow gap beneath. The mere existence of that portal between their rooms sent heat flooding through her cheeks as she imagined him just beyond, perhaps changing from his travelling clothes, perhaps thinking of her as she was thinking of him. And she pressed her palm flat against the cool wood for just a moment before jerking it back as though burned, turning away to focus on preparing for dinner. But her hands shook as she attempted to arrange her hair without the help of a lady's maid, and she had just managed to secure the last pin when a soft knock came at her door, which opened to reveal a young maid bearing a message that the Duchess requested her presence in the library before the other guests assembled, and Eleanor made her way through the corridors she was still learning, finding the library easily by following the sound of voices. But as she approached the doorway, she heard Lord Greville's oily tones and froze. Such a charming little thing, Thornfield's latest acquisition, though one wonders if he knows she's only here because of what her father owes. And before Eleanor could decide whether to retreat or announce herself, she heard her own voice responding with icy composure as she stepped into view. "His Grace knows everything about my circumstances, Lord Greville, as honesty between betrothed couples is something we both value highly," watching with satisfaction as his florid face darkened with anger. But before he could respond, Frederick appeared in the doorway behind her like a wolf scenting threat to his territory, his presence filling the room with sudden danger as he said in that deadly quiet voice she remembered from Hyde Park, "Greville, you seem to have lost your way. The drawing-room is elsewhere." And the Viscount departed with a mocking bow that promised this was far from over, leaving Eleanor alone with Frederick, who studied her for a long moment before saying quietly, "You handled that well," to which she replied with more honesty than perhaps was wise, "I've had practice with predators, Your Grace," and something flickered in his eyes that might have been admiration or might have been something else entirely, as he offered her his arm to escort her to dinner, where he would seat her in the place of honor at his right hand, a declaration of her status that no one could mistake, though she noticed how Lady Harriet Chamberlain whispered behind her fan to her companion, and how several of the ladies assessed her simple blue gown with knowing smirks. But Colonel Hastings proved himself a true ally by engaging her in warm conversation about books, and asking her opinion on matters that showed he saw her as more than just Frederick's temporary ornament. And through it all, she felt Frederick's attention on her like a physical touch, protective and possessive in equal measure, making her wonder if perhaps this arrangement was becoming something more complicated than either of them had intended. Eleanor had barely slept, her mind returning again and again to that mahogany door and the man who lay beyond it. So when dawn broke through her windows, she rose and dressed in one of her old morning gowns, needing the familiar comfort of worn fabric against her skin, and made her way to the gardens, where the morning mist still clung to the roses, and the dew caught the early light like scattered diamonds, breathing in the sweet scent of wisteria and trying to calm the tumult of feelings that threatened to overwhelm her careful control, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to find Frederick approaching, dressed simply in riding clothes with his hair still damp from washing, looking younger and less guarded than she had ever seen him, and for a moment they simply stood there in the morning quiet, neither quite knowing how to navigate this unexpected meeting, until he said quietly, "I often walk here early, before the house wakes. It helps me think." And she found herself responding, "I couldn't sleep either. The grandeur of your home is rather overwhelming for someone accustomed to 2 small rooms," which made him frown as he fell into step beside her, their pace unhurried as they wandered deeper into the gardens, where ancient yew hedges created private alcoves and hidden benches. And after several minutes of surprisingly comfortable silence, he asked, "Do you miss it? Your former life, before the difficulties began?" And Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I miss feeling secure, knowing my place in the world. But perhaps that security was always an illusion. Perhaps we are all just one scandal or misfortune away from losing everything we thought permanent." And something in her words seemed to strike him deeply, because he stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the morning sun illuminating his scar and making his grey eyes appear almost silver, as he said with unexpected intensity, "You speak as though you've lost everything. But watching you these past days, seeing how you hold your head high despite the whispers, how you face down men like Greville without flinching, I think perhaps you've found something more valuable than social position." And Eleanor felt her breath catch at the admiration in his voice, her heart beginning to race as he continued, "Most women of my acquaintance would have crumbled under such circumstances, but you've transformed difficulty into strength, and I find myself wondering if our arrangement has become more complicated than either of us intended." And before she could respond, before she could even process what he might be suggesting, Lady Beatrice's voice carried across the garden calling them to breakfast, and the moment shattered like glass, leaving Eleanor to follow Frederick back toward the house with her mind spinning and her heart pounding, wondering if she had imagined the longing in his eyes, or if perhaps this false engagement was becoming something neither of them had expected, something that would hurt far worse than any scandal when their week ended, and she had to walk away from Thornfield Manor and the scarred Duke, who was beginning to matter far more than was safe for either of them. The afternoon brought an unexpected invitation, as Eleanor sat in the morning room attempting to focus on her embroidery, while the other ladies gossiped around her, their voices rising and falling like waves of spite, when Lady Beatrice swept in with the announcement that the gentlemen had returned from their ride and proposed an archery contest on the south lawn. And though Eleanor tried to demur, knowing she had no skill with a bow and would only embarrass herself further, Frederick appeared in the doorway still wind-swept from riding and said quietly, "I should like to see you try, Miss Ashworth," his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made refusal impossible. So she found herself on the perfectly manicured lawn, with a bow in her hands that felt foreign and unwieldy, watching as Lady Harriet and the other accomplished ladies sent arrow after arrow toward the distant targets with practiced ease, their laughter tinkling like broken glass when Eleanor's first attempt went wildly astray. But Frederick stepped behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and adjusted her stance with gentle hands, murmuring instructions in a low voice that sent shivers down her spine. "Draw the string to your cheek, not your chest, and breathe out as you release." And when she loosed the arrow, it flew true, not hitting the center, but at least finding the target, drawing surprised murmurs from the watching crowd, and Lord Greville's mocking voice cut through the moment, saying, "How touching, Thornfield, teaching your little sparrow to fly." But before Frederick could respond with the cold fury Eleanor could see building in his eyes, Colonel Hastings stepped forward with a laugh and challenged Greville to a contest, diffusing the tension with practiced ease, and as the competition continued, Eleanor found herself standing beside Frederick in comfortable silence, no longer required to perform, simply existing in this moment where the afternoon sun warmed her face and the man beside her stood closer than propriety strictly allowed, his presence a shield against the barbs and whispers of society. Until Lady Beatrice called them all to take refreshment, and Eleanor turned to find Frederick watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something soft and wondering that made her heart skip before he offered his arm to escort her inside. And as they walked, he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "You did well today, not just with the bow, but with all of it, the way you refused to let them diminish you." and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected praise, managing only to whisper, "I've had an excellent teacher in the art of maintaining dignity under fire," which drew from him another of those rare, transformative smiles that made her wish desperately that this was real, that she truly belonged here at his side, rather than merely playing a role that would end in just 3 more days. A thought that filled her with a grief so sharp it stole her breath. The evening musicale arranged by Lady Beatrice for the 3rd night of the house party promised to be another trial of Eleanor's composure as she descended the stairs in a borrowed gown of amber silk that Mrs. Fleming had procured from somewhere, her hair arranged by the kind housekeeper's own hands, since Eleanor still had no lady's maid. And though she felt more presentable than she had in days, the knowledge that tonight she would be expected to perform before the assembled guests made her stomach twist with dread. For while she had learned piano as a girl, years without an instrument had left her skills rusty at best. But when she entered the music room and saw Frederick standing by the pianoforte, his expression unreadable as always, something in the way he immediately moved toward her made her pulse quicken with an emotion that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the growing awareness between them that seemed to intensify with each passing hour, and before she could speak, he said quietly, "Mother has arranged the program so that you need not perform alone if you prefer not to." A kindness that nearly undid her careful control. But before she could respond, Lady Harriet's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Oh, how thoughtful, Your Grace, to spare us all by ensuring your fiancé has assistance." And Eleanor felt Frederick tense beside her, his jaw tightening in that way she had come to recognize as barely leashed anger, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm and said with perfect calm, "How kind of you to concern yourself with the evening's entertainment, Lady Harriet. Though I assure you I am quite capable of managing a simple piece without assistance." And something flickered in Frederick's eyes that might have been pride as she moved to take her seat at the instrument, her fingers trembling only slightly as she began to play a piece she had loved in happier days, a haunting melody that spoke of longing and loss. And though she missed a note here and there, the emotion she poured into the music seemed to hold the room spellbound, even silencing Lady Harriet's whispers. And when she finished and dared to look up, she found Frederick staring at her with an expression of such naked admiration that her breath caught in her throat. And then Greville's mocking applause broke the spell as he drawled, "Brava, Miss Ashworth, though I seem to recall you played with more skill when your family still had a music master." A cruel reminder of all she had lost that made her hands clench in her lap. But Frederick was already moving, positioning himself between her and Greville with a protective stance that made her heart race as he said in a voice like winter ice, "I find there is more beauty in music played with genuine feeling than in mere technical perfection, though I suspect that is a distinction lost on those who possess neither skill nor soul." And the insult landed with deadly precision, making Greville flush an ugly red, while Colonel Hastings quickly suggested they move on to the next performer, but not before Frederick offered Eleanor his hand to help her rise from the bench, his fingers warm and steady around hers as he murmured for her ears alone, "You were magnificent." The next morning brought an unexpected summons, as Eleanor was breakfasting in her room, trying to gather her courage for another day of performing, when Mrs. Fleming knocked softly and informed her that His Grace requested her presence in his private study immediately. And though the housekeeper's expression was carefully neutral, Eleanor detected a hint of concern that made her pulse quicken with worry as she smoothed her morning dress and followed the older woman through corridors she was still learning to navigate, her mind racing with possibilities of what could have prompted such an early and private meeting. And when she entered the study, she found Frederick standing by the window with his back to her, his posture rigid with tension, the morning light throwing his scarred profile into sharp relief as he turned at her entrance, and the look in his grey eyes made her heart stutter to a stop. for there was something wild and desperate there she had never seen before, and he crossed to her in 3 quick strides, taking her hands in his before she could even curtsy, his gloves discarded, so she felt for the first time the scarred texture of his skin against hers as he said urgently, "Eleanor, forgive me, but I must speak plainly, for there is no time for delicacy," using her given name for the first time, and she could only nod, struck mute by the intensity of his manner and the way his hands trembled slightly as they held hers. "I have just received word that your father has fled London. Apparently he could not resist the gaming tables even with his debts cleared, and he has amassed new obligations to men far less civilized than Greville." And Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the implications crashed over her, for without her father's presence to maintain even the fiction of propriety, her position here became even more precarious. But Frederick was still speaking, his voice low and urgent. "There is more. Greville knows of your father's flight, and intends to use it against us. Against you. He plans to announce it publicly tonight at dinner unless—" And here Frederick paused, his jaw clenching with visible fury. "Unless you agree to leave with him immediately, abandoning our arrangement and placing yourself under his protection." And Eleanor swayed on her feet, only Frederick's hands on hers keeping her upright as the full horror of her situation became clear. For now she had no father to return to, no home, however shabby, nothing but the clothes on her back and a sister whose debut would be ruined by this fresh scandal. And Frederick must have seen the despair in her eyes, for he drew her closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the sandalwood and leather scent that had become so familiar these past days. As he said fiercely, "Eleanor, look at me. I swear to you on my honor as a gentleman and a soldier that I will not let him touch you, not now, not ever. But we must act quickly to protect both your reputation and Sophia's future." And something in the way he said her sister's name, with such careful consideration, broke through her shock enough for her to whisper, "What can we do? The week is not yet over, but surely after this—" But Frederick was already shaking his head, his expression settling into the determined lines she recognized from his military bearing. "There is only one way to place you permanently beyond his reach and salvage your family's honor," he said, and she knew what he would say before the words left his lips, knew it with a certainty that should have terrified her, but instead sent a wild hope spiraling through her chest. "We must make our engagement real, Eleanor. Marry me in truth, today if possible, before Greville can move against us." Eleanor stood frozen in Frederick's study, the morning light streaming through the windows as his proposal hung in the air between them. Marry him in truth, today if possible, and she could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at him as the implications crashed over her in waves, for this was no longer a business arrangement, but something real and permanent and terrifying. And she must have swayed because Frederick's hands tightened on hers, anchoring her as he said urgently, "I know this is not what we agreed. I know I am asking far more than I have any right to, but Eleanor, please let me protect you properly." And there was something in his voice, a rawness she had never heard before that made her meet his eyes, those grey depths that had become so familiar these past days. And what she saw there stole what little breath remained in her lungs. For this was not duty or obligation, or even mere protectiveness. This was something deeper, something that matched the wild racing of her own heart. And she found herself whispering, "But Frederick, you cannot want this, cannot want me. I bring nothing but scandal and debt and difficulty." But he was already shaking his head, his scarred hands holding hers with infinite gentleness as he said, "You bring yourself, Eleanor, and that is worth more than all the dowries and connections in England." And before she could respond there was a sharp knock at the door, and Colonel Hastings entered without waiting for permission, his usually cheerful face grave as he said, "Forgive the intrusion, but Greville is stirring up the guests, dropping hints about some scandal involving Miss Ashworth's father, and Lady Harriet is all too eager to spread whatever poison he's offering." And Frederick's expression hardened into the cold mask she remembered from their first meeting, but his hands on hers remained gentle as he turned back to her and said, "We have little time. The local vicar is my mother's cousin, and will perform the ceremony without question if we go now. But Eleanor, I will not force this, if you prefer to face whatever comes without this binding between us." And she looked at him, really looked at him, this scarred warrior who had shown her more kindness in 6 days than she had known in years, who had paid her father's debts without question, who stood now offering her not just protection, but something that looked dangerously like devotion. And she thought of Sophia, of her sister's bright future that would die if this new scandal broke. Thought of her father wherever he had fled, leaving them to face the consequences of his weakness again. Thought of Greville's cruel smile and grasping hands. But most of all, she thought of Frederick's laugh in the carriage, of the way he had stepped between her and every threat, of the connecting door between their rooms that represented all the possibilities she had been too frightened to name. And so she lifted her chin and said with a steadiness that surprised them both, "Then let us marry, your grace, before Lord Greville can do any more damage." And something blazed in Frederick's eyes that made her knees weak as he lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to each palm. The journey to the village church was the longest and shortest of Eleanor's life, as Frederick helped her into his carriage with hands that trembled slightly despite his soldier's control, and Colonel Hastings climbed in after them to serve as witness, his usually jovial face serious with the weight of what they were about to do. And Eleanor found herself staring at her hands folded in her lap, her grandmother's ring catching the light as the carriage rolled through Thornfield's gates and onto the country road, and she was acutely aware of Frederick beside her, the warmth of him, the tension radiating from his body as he sat perfectly still. And when she risked a glance at him, she found him watching her with an expression so intense it made her heart skip. And he must have seen her nervousness, for he reached over and covered her hands with one of his scarred palm warm against her cold fingers as he said quietly, "We do not have to do this, Eleanor, even now if you wish to turn back." But she shook her head, finding her voice with effort. "No, I have made my choice, Frederick, and I will not be frightened from it." And something in his grey eyes softened at her words as his hand tightened on hers. And Colonel Hastings cleared his throat and said with forced cheer, "Never thought I would see the day Frederick Ravenscroft rushed to the altar, though I must say, Miss Ashworth, you have accomplished what Napoleon's entire army could not. You have brought the war duke to his knees." And despite everything, Eleanor found herself almost smiling at that, and Frederick muttered something about court-martial that made Hastings laugh. And then they were pulling up before the small stone church with its Norman tower and ancient yew trees, and Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain both men must hear it as Frederick helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. And the vicar was waiting for them, a thin elderly man with kind eyes who took one look at Frederick's face and asked no questions beyond the necessary, simply led them into the cool, dim interior where dust motes danced in the coloured light from stained glass windows, and Eleanor had a moment of pure panic as they stood before the altar, for this was real and binding, and forever, not some week-long arrangement that could be dissolved. But then Frederick took her hand again, properly this time, and when she looked up at him, she saw not the cold Duke society feared, but the man who had laughed at her observation about poetry, who had stepped between her and every threat, who was now binding his life to hers to save not just her reputation, but her sister's future. And as the vicar began to speak, the ancient words, Eleanor found her panic settling into something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like hope. The words were simple and ancient, words that had bound countless couples before them, but Eleanor felt their weight settle into her bones as she repeated them after the vicar, her voice barely above a whisper at first, but growing stronger with each phrase. I, Eleanor Margaret, take thee, Frederick James. And she felt Frederick's hands tighten infinitesimally on hers as she spoke his given name for the first time, a name she had not even known until this moment. And when it came time for the ring, Frederick paused, clearly having not thought that far ahead in his haste. But Eleanor found herself sliding her grandmother's ring from her right hand and pressing it into his palm, saying quietly, "Use this. It seems fitting." And something shifted in his expression as he took the worn gold band with its tiny sapphires, this last piece of her old life that she was now giving to begin a new one. And his hands were perfectly steady as he slid it onto her left hand, though his voice was rough as he repeated his own vows, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning she could not quite decipher. And when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Eleanor had a moment of pure unreality, for she was now the Duchess of Thornfield, a title that sat strangely on her shoulders like a gown made for someone else. But then Frederick was raising her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to the ring that had been her grandmother's and was now her wedding band. And the look in his eyes made her forget about titles and propriety and the speed of everything, made her forget everything but the fact that this scarred, complicated man was now her husband. And as they signed the register with Colonel Hastings as witness, Eleanor's hand shook only slightly, and Frederick stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that when she glanced up their eyes met and held for a long moment that made her newly ringed finger tingle. And then they were walking back down the aisle of the tiny church, married, bound, protected, and Eleanor could not quite grasp that less than an hour ago she had been Miss Ashworth drowning in scandal, and now she was a duchess with the power of the Ravenscroft name behind her. And as they emerged into the sunlight, she blinked, momentarily blinded, and Frederick's hand came to rest on the small of her back, steadying her, guiding her toward the carriage where Colonel Hastings was already holding the door. And as Frederick handed her up, his fingers lingered on hers, and he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Thank you for trusting me, Eleanor." And she wanted to tell him that the trust went both ways, that he had just bound himself to a woman with nothing to recommend her but debt and scandal. But the words stuck in her throat, and she could only nod as he climbed in beside her for the journey back to Thornfield, where everything waited, where Greville was surely spreading his poison, where they would have to face whatever came next. But together now, bound by law and something else, something nameless and fragile that made her pulse race when Frederick's knee brushed hers as the carriage rolled forward, carrying them back to face the storm they had temporarily escaped. The carriage ride back to Thornfield passed in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but charged with awareness of what had just transpired. Eleanor acutely conscious of the weight of her grandmother's ring, now on her left hand, moved there by Frederick's scarred fingers in a ceremony that should have been a sham, but had felt achingly real, and she could not stop stealing glances at him. This man who was now her husband, who sat with his jaw tight and his grey eyes fixed on the passing countryside, as if he too were grappling with the magnitude of what they had just done. And Colonel Hastings, bless him, seemed to understand their need for quiet and kept his own counsel, though she caught him watching them both with an expression of fond concern. And as they rolled through Thornfield's gates, Eleanor felt a flutter of panic, for how would they explain this sudden marriage to the house-party guests who were expecting an engagement ball, not a wedding announcement? But Frederick must have sensed her anxiety, for he reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing over the ring that had been her last connection to her old life, and was now the symbol of her new one. And he said quietly, "We will face them together, Eleanor, whatever comes." And the use of her given name, still so you between them, made her heart skip as they pulled up before the manor's entrance, where footmen were already hurrying out, their faces carefully neutral, though she could see the curiosity burning in their eyes, and as Frederick helped her down, his hands lingered on her waist, and he murmured for her ears alone, "Courage, Duchess." And the title that should have felt foreign, instead, gave her strength as they climbed the steps together, her hand on his arm, playing the part of newlyweds, though perhaps they were not playing at all anymore, and the moment they entered the hall, Eleanor could feel the shift in atmosphere, the way conversations died and heads turned, and there was Lady Beatrice hurrying toward them, her face a study in shock that quickly transformed into something Eleanor could not quite read. And behind her came the other guests, Lady Harriet's mouth already pursing in disapproval, other faces alight with the anticipation of scandal. And at the back of the group stood Lord Greville, his expression dark with fury, barely concealed behind a mask of politeness, and Eleanor's steps faltered for just a moment before Frederick's hand covered hers on his arm, warm and steady and reassuring. And then Lady Beatrice was upon them, her sharp eyes taking in every detail from Eleanor's slightly rumpled appearance to the way Frederick stood protective and possessive beside her, and Eleanor braced herself for recriminations or accusations of impropriety, but instead Lady Beatrice's face softened into something almost like joy as she breathed, "You married her, oh Frederick, you actually married her." And before Eleanor could process this unexpected reaction, Lady Beatrice had pulled her into an embrace that smelled of lavender and felt like coming home. The hush that fell over the entrance hall was complete, every eye fixed on the tableau they presented, as Lady Beatrice released Eleanor from her lavender-scented embrace and held her at arm's length, those sharp Ravenscroft eyes that missed nothing, taking in every detail from the simple gold band on Eleanor's left hand to the way Frederick stood close enough to catch her if she faltered, and Eleanor felt exposed, laid bare before this woman who had every right to rage at her son for marrying without notice, for binding himself to a nobody with nothing but scandal to her name. But instead, Lady Beatrice's eyes were bright with what looked suspiciously like tears as she said, "My dear girl, when Frederick told me of your engagement, I hoped, but I never dared dream he would have the sense to secure you so quickly." And before Eleanor could process this astonishing statement, Lady Beatrice had turned to her son, reaching up to cup his scarred cheek with a tenderness that made Eleanor's throat tight. "You did not let fear rule you for once, my darling boy. I am so very proud." And Frederick's jaw worked as if he were struggling with words, his grey eyes finding Eleanor's over his mother's head, and in them she saw her own confusion reflected, for Lady Beatrice seemed genuinely delighted rather than appalled, and around them the other guests were stirring, whispers rising like a tide, and Eleanor caught fragments. Married, special license, scandalous haste, and through it all Lord Greville stood frozen, his face a mask of barely controlled fury that made Eleanor step unconsciously closer to Frederick, who noticed immediately, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back, in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. And Lady Harriet Chamberlain pushed forward, her thin face pinched with disapproval as she said, "Lady Beatrice, surely you cannot approve of such unseemly haste. Why, they have known each other barely a week." And Lady Beatrice turned to her with a smile sharp as winter ice. "Lady Harriet, when one's son who has refused every suitable match for 3 years suddenly finds a woman who makes him smile, one does not quibble over timing." And Eleanor felt Frederick stiffen beside her at this revelation, clearly as surprised as she by his mother's ready acceptance, and Colonel Hastings stepped forward then, bowing deeply to Eleanor. "Your Grace, may I be the first to offer my heartfelt congratulations. Ravenscroft could not have chosen better." And the use of her new title sent a shock through Eleanor, for she was a duchess now, this man's duchess, and other guests began to approach, some sincere in their well wishes, others merely curious. And through it all, Frederick remained at her side, a solid presence that kept her grounded when everything felt unreal. And it was only when Lord Greville finally approached, his smile a mockery of politeness, that Frederick's hand tightened on her back, warning and protection in the simple gesture. Lord Greville's approach was measured, his footsteps deliberate on the marble floor as he stopped before them with a bow so correct it bordered on mockery, his pale eyes sliding from Frederick's rigid face to Eleanor's composed one, and she felt the cold emanating from him like winter frost despite the warmth of the spring afternoon filtering through the tall windows. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Frederick with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "My congratulations on your sudden nuptials, though I confess myself surprised that a man of your reputation for careful strategy would act with such impetuous haste." And the implication was clear, the suggestion that Frederick had been trapped or tricked, and Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with anger rather than shame. But before she could speak, Frederick's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "I have learned, Greville, that when one finds something of true value, hesitation is the fool's course." And his hand on Eleanor's back pressed slightly, drawing her closer to his side in a gesture that felt less like performance and more like claiming, "Your own military record demonstrated the consequences of hesitation quite memorably, as I recall." And Eleanor watched Greville's face go white, then red, understanding that Frederick had just referenced the cowardice that had gotten men killed, had publicly reminded everyone present of the shadow that hung over the Viscount's honour, and the other guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension crackling between the two men, and Lady Harriet's eyes were bright with the promise of gossip to spread. And Colonel Hastings moved subtly closer, a soldier positioning himself for potential conflict, but Greville merely inclined his head with that same false smile. "Of course, Your Grace, I meant no offence to your lovely bride." And his gaze found Eleanor's, and in it she saw something that made her blood chill, a promise that this was not over, that he would find another way to hurt them. "I merely wished to extend my felicitations and express my hope that this marriage proves as fortunate as the circumstances of its inception." And then he was moving away, melting back into the crowd of guests who parted for him as if sensing the danger he carried, and Eleanor released a breath she had not known she was holding, her knees suddenly unsteady beneath the skirts of her travelling dress, and Frederick must have felt her tremor, for he turned to her with concern in his grey eyes. "Come," he said quietly. "My mother will understand if we retire briefly." And before she could protest, he was guiding her through a side door, away from the watching eyes and whispered speculation, into a small parlour she had not seen before, and only when the door closed behind them did she allow herself to lean against the nearest chair, her composure cracking. "He will not stop," she said, the words tumbling out. "He will never stop until he has destroyed us both." And Frederick stood before her, his scarred face unreadable, but his voice gentle as he replied, "Let him try." The parlour was the small and intimate, clearly a private retreat rather than a room meant for guests, its walls lined with books and a single window overlooking the rain-swept gardens where spring flowers bent beneath the weight of water droplets. And Eleanor gripped the back of the chair until her knuckles went white, her breath coming too fast as the enormity of what she had done crashed over her like a wave, for she had married him, truly married him, and now she was bound to this scarred duke who had been a stranger mere days ago, and Greville's pale eyes haunted her. That promise of retribution that she knew he would fulfill because men like him did not accept defeat. They merely changed tactics, and Frederick stood before her, solid and patient, making no move to touch her, though his hands were clenched at his sides as if restraining himself. And she looked up at him through eyes that burned with unshed tears. "I have brought you nothing but trouble," she said, her voice cracking on the words, "Greville will not rest until he has ruined us both. And I have given him the perfect weapon by marrying you in such haste. They will say I trapped you, that I schemed my way into your title." And Frederick's jaw tightened, his scar pulling as it did when he was struggling with emotion. And when he spoke, his voice was rough. "Let them say what they will. Eleanor, I chose this. I chose you, and I would make the same choice again, knowing everything that would follow." And the certainty in his words made her breath catch, made her search his grey eyes for any sign of regret, and find none, only that fierce protectiveness that had been there from the beginning, from that first night on the terrace when she had been nothing but a desperate stranger. And she released the chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face, trying to compose herself. And Frederick finally moved, crossing the space between them to stand close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the chill of the rain-dampened air. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that undid her more than any grand declaration could have. "Look at me." And she lowered her hands to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart stutter in her chest, something raw and vulnerable beneath his usual composure. "I spent 3 years believing I would never feel anything again," he said quietly, "that the war had burned that capacity out of me, along with everything else. And then you appeared on that terrace, speaking to the darkness as if it might answer. And something in me recognized something in you." And Eleanor's eyes finally overflowed, tears sliding down her cheeks as he raised one gloved hand to brush them away, the leather soft against her skin. "Whatever comes," he continued, "we face it together. That is what marriage means. That is what this means." And she nodded, unable to speak, unable to do anything but lean into his touch and let herself believe, for this one moment, that she had found harbour at last. The rain continued to fall beyond the window as they stood together in that small parlour, and Eleanor became aware of how close Frederick had moved, close enough that she could see the individual threads of silver in his grey eyes, the fine lines that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens carried alone. And when his gloved hand remained against her cheek, she did not pull away, could not pull away. For something had shifted between them in this moment of vulnerability, and she understood with sudden clarity that this man who had been a stranger mere days ago had become something essential, something she had not known she was missing until he appeared on that moonlit terrace. And Frederick seemed to recognize the change in the air as well, for his breath caught and his hand trembled slightly against her skin. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he no longer attempted to hide. "I did not expect this," he said quietly. "When I proposed this arrangement, I thought only of escaping my mother's matchmaking, of solving a problem with military efficiency." And Eleanor found herself leaning into his touch despite every warning her cautious heart offered. "And now?" she asked, and the question hung between them like a held breath, and Frederick's scarred face was so open, so unguarded in this moment that she felt tears threaten again. "Now I find myself unwilling to imagine Thornfield without you in it," he admitted. "Unwilling to imagine my life without your laughter, your honesty, your courage in the face of everything that should have broken you." And Eleanor's hand rose of its own accord to touch his scar, that ridge of damaged flesh that ran from temple to jaw, and he flinched, but did not pull away, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Does it frighten you?" he asked, and she heard the old wound beneath the words, the fear that had kept him isolated for 3 years. "No," she said firmly. "It reminds me of what you survived, of the strength that brought you home when so many did not return." And something in his expression cracked, a wall crumbling that he had built brick by brick since the war, and he turned his face to press his lips against her palm in a gesture so tender it stole her breath. "Eleanor." He said her name like a prayer, like a promise, and she understood that whatever came next, whatever schemes Greville enacted, whatever gossip Lady Harriet spread, they would face it as Frederick had said, together. And when a knock came at the parlour door, they stepped apart reluctantly, and Eleanor smoothed her travelling dress with hands that still trembled as Mrs. Fleming entered to announce that their chambers were ready, that the other guests were gathering for tea, and Frederick's mask slid back into place, though his eyes remained warm when they met hers. "Shall we, Your Grace?" he asked, and the title on his lips felt different now, felt real in a way it had not during the rushed ceremony, and Eleanor took his offered arm and let him lead her back into the world of watchers and whispers. But she carried with her the memory of his confession, and it burned like a small flame against the cold.